If you have a British coin, any British coin, any year, any denomination, flip it over. Next to the monarch's face, you'll find two letters, F.D. They've been there for 500 years. Most people walk past them every day without asking what they mean. F.D. stands for Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith, a title the Pope gave to the King of England in 1521 as a reward for defending the Catholic Church. 10 years later, that same king ripped England away from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of a new one, and executed anyone who disagreed. He kept the title anyway. Every monarch since has kept it. It's still on the coins. The chain of events that turned a defender of the faith into the man who destroyed the faith, that chain started with a bowl of soup, a single bowl of poisoned soup, served in a bishop's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in February 1531. 2 people died. 17 more nearly followed. And the man accused of the poisoning was executed by a method so extreme it had to be invented specifically for him. Boiled alive in a public square. A law was written with his name on it. It was used exactly twice in all of English history before being abolished forever. The official story is that he was a cook who played a prank that went wrong, that the king was horrified, that Parliament acted, that justice was served. But the official story has a hole in it the size of a cathedral. The poisoning happened exactly 7 days after the bishop, the target, publicly humiliated the king in front of every clergyman in England, blocking the one thing Henry VIII wanted more than anything on earth. 7 days. And the man who ordered the unprecedented punishment, the man who personally walked into Parliament and demanded a new law, a new crime, a new method of death, was the same man who had the most to gain from that bishop's silence. 500 years later, this case is still open. And the question that nobody answered in 1531 is the same one we're going to work through right now. Was the king punishing the crime, or was he burying the evidence? Centuries cold. Chapter 1. The Cook, the Bishop, and the Cauldron. Before we get to the kitchen, you need to know one thing about the woman at the center of all of this. Because even if you've never heard her name, you're living in the world she helped create. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, the woman he split an entire country away from the Catholic Church to marry. That split, the English Reformation, created the Church of England, which still exists today. It triggered centuries of religious wars, shaped the colonization of America, and redrew the political map of Europe. Every Anglican church on the planet, every Episcopal parish, every constitutional principle about the separation of church and state in the English-speaking world connects back, one way or another, to a king who wanted to marry Anne Boleyn and a pope who told him no. In February of 1531, that marriage hadn't happened yet. Henry had been fighting for it for 4 years, and the man standing in his way, the loudest, most effective, most dangerous obstacle to the divorce, the remarriage, and everything that would follow, was a 62-year-old bishop named John Fisher. What happened in Fisher's kitchen on February 18, 1531, would hand Henry the tool to remove that obstacle. But not in the way you'd expect, and not on a timeline anyone has been able to explain. The kitchen. John Fisher was the Bishop of Rochester. Remember what that meant in 1531, not just a clergyman, a landlord controlling an entire diocese of territory and income, an automatic member of the House of Lords, a legislator with a vote in Parliament on the same institutional level as a duke, and an intellectual heavyweight. The historian Eamon Duffy called him the greatest Catholic theologian in Europe during the first 2 decades of Henry's reign. Chancellor of Cambridge, preacher of the royal funeral sermons, a man the king could not ignore. Fisher's London residence sat in Lambeth Marsh, south bank of the Thames, directly across the river from Westminster. You could see the palace from his windows. And in the kitchen of that residence, on a Saturday morning in February, someone put a white powder into a vessel of balm. Balm, the thick, yeasty liquid skimmed off fermenting ale, used as the base for pottage, the dense stew that fed everyone in the house, not portioned individually, made in bulk. One vessel, one batch, dozens of bowls. The bishop's table, the servants' hall, and the beggars who came to the gate every afternoon to collect the leftovers as charity. One contaminated source, the entire household. By mid-afternoon, 17 people were violently ill, cramping that folded grown men at the waist, purging, convulsions. 2 of them died. Bennet Kerwin, a gentleman of the bishop's household, a member of the staff, and Alice Trippitt, a beggar, a widow, who'd eaten the leftover pottage at the gate. Not a single person who died was important. No nobles, no dignitaries, a servant and a beggar. And the bishop, the man whose kitchen it was, the man who everyone assumed was the target, didn't eat that day. Why not? 2 explanations survive, and neither comes from a contemporary source. Richard Hall, Fisher's first biographer, writing in 1655, more than a century later, in a text designed to promote Fisher's sainthood, said the bishop was so absorbed in his studies that he skipped dinner entirely. A more modern historian, G.W. Bernard, proposed something darker. Fisher may have followed his known habit of not eating until the beggars at his gate had been fed first. If that's the case, then Alice Trippitt and the others at the door were accidental food tasters. They ate first. They died first. We don't know which is true. What matters is Fisher survived. And Fisher alive in February 1531 was a problem for the most powerful man in England. To understand why, we need to rewind, not by days, by years. By 1531, Henry VIII had been trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon for 4 years. Catherine was a Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She and Henry had been married since 1509. One surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Before Mary, stillbirths, infant deaths, miscarriages. Catherine was past 40. There would be no son. And Henry needed a son. Not wanted, needed. The Tudor dynasty was 2 generations old. His father had won the crown on a battlefield, ending 30 years of civil war. Without a male heir, the whole project was one heartbeat from collapse. Around 1526, Henry's attention locked onto Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, educated, ambitious, and unwilling to be a mistress. Her sister Mary had already taken that role and been discarded. Anne wanted the crown, nothing less. So here's the situation. Henry wants to marry Anne. To marry Anne, he needs to divorce Catherine. To divorce Catherine, he needs the Pope to annul the marriage. And the Pope, remember this is the 1530s, the Pope is the supreme authority over every Catholic institution in Europe, won't do it. Not because he disagrees theologically, but because Catherine's nephew is the emperor whose army sacked Rome in 1527. The Pope is, in practical terms, the emperor's hostage. Annulling Catherine's marriage would be a public humiliation of the most powerful man on the continent. The Pope stalls for years. Commissions, legates, procedural dead ends. In January 1531, the Pope formally prohibits Henry from remarrying while the case is pending, and that's when Henry decides, if Rome won't give him what he wants, he'll take it from his own clergy. What happened 7 days before the poisoning? January 24th, 1531. Henry charges the entire English clergy, every priest, bishop, abbot in the country, with violating an old law called the Statute of Praemunire. The crime? Recognizing papal authority without explicit royal permission. This was something every clergyman had done for centuries. That was the whole point of being Catholic clergy. But the law was on the books, and Henry's lawyers decided to enforce it retroactively. The penalty? Total confiscation of property. Life imprisonment. Nobody was actually going to prosecute 15,000 clergymen. The whole thing was a shakedown, the legal equivalent of holding a knife to someone's throat and then asking them for a favor. February 7th. The clergy offers money, a huge sum, between 40 and 100,000 pounds. Henry rejects it. Not the amount, the terms. He wants the clergy to accept 5 additional articles. The first one is the detonation. The clergy must recognize Henry as, and this is the exact phrase, sole protector and supreme head of the Church and clergy of England. Not the Pope, the King, supreme head of the Church in a Catholic country. The Convocation, the clergy's own legislative body, rejected it, unanimously. And the man who led that rejection was John Fisher. Remember, Fisher wants to protect the Church's independence from the Crown. That's his life's work. He spoke against the King's title with such force that he swung the entire episcopate into a block vote. The answer was no. The negotiations ran February 8th through the 10th. 3 days, face to face. The King's negotiators at the table, Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's father. Remember, the Boleyns need the divorce to happen. Fisher is blocking the divorce. And now Thomas Boleyn is sitting across the table from Fisher's allies, delivering the King's ultimatums. Fisher's allies and Anne Boleyn's father weren't exchanging letters across the country. They were breathing the same air, sitting at the same table, 7 days before someone poisoned Fisher's kitchen. The king's response to the rejection was immediate and targeted. He sent messengers to remind the convocation what praemunere meant: total confiscation, prison, ruin. This threat was sent specifically after Fisher was identified as the man behind the no vote, February 11th. Under that pressure, the Archbishop of Canterbury presented a revised formula. It accepted the king's title, with one addition: a qualifying clause that multiple independent sources attribute to Fisher personally, as far as the law of God allows. 8 words. They transformed the meaning of the surrender. With the clause, the clergy weren't conceding absolute royal authority. They were conceding authority only within limits set by divine law, which in practice meant limits set by the Church. Fisher found the loophole. The clergy accepted. The Crown, for the moment, didn't push further. That was February 11th. February 18th, exactly 7 days later, someone poured poison into the yeast in John Fisher's kitchen. Who had motive? Let's lay out the suspects, because there are more than you've been told. Suspect 1, Roose himself. The official story. Richard Roose, also spelled Rouse, Rose, or Cook, depending on the document, was a cook in Fisher's household, or someone who knew the cook. Even that basic fact is disputed. The official sources call him a cook. Fisher's biographer, writing over a century later, said he was an acquaintance who slipped into the kitchen when the real cook went to fetch drink. Under interrogation in the Tower, on the rack with his joints being pulled apart, Roose confessed. He said he put a white powder in the balm. He said he thought it was a purgative, a laxative, a prank to give his fellow servants stomach cramps, not a murder attempt, a stupid joke. But when a man is stretched on the rack until his shoulders come out of their sockets, he doesn't tell the truth. He tells whatever he thinks will make the stretching stop. And 2 questions remain. If the powder was a harmless laxative, why did 2 people die? And where did a cook get a substance that potent? The imperial ambassador Chapuis wrote to Emperor Charles V in March 1531 and stated explicitly, the source of the poison was still unknown. No subsequent document ever identified it. Suspect 2. The Boleyns. This is the theory you know from television. Anne Boleyn's family, her father Thomas, her brother George, ordered the poisoning to eliminate Fisher, the single biggest obstacle to the king's divorce and remarriage. Remember their objective. They need the divorce to happen. Anne becomes queen only if Catherine stops being queen. And Fisher is the man who just blocked the king's power grab over the church, the power grab that would eventually give Henry the authority to divorce Catherine without Rome's permission. The rumour circulated in London immediately after the poisoning. Chapuis reported it to the emperor. Thomas More, still Lord Chancellor at the time, brought it directly to the king. Henry's reaction was fury. He said Anne was being blamed for everything. Chapuis himself, who despised Anne Boleyn, who would have buried her in a heartbeat if he'd had proof, admitted he didn't know where the poison came from. He was guessing, and he knew he was guessing. The TV show The Tudors dramatized the whole thing as fact. Thomas Boleyn paying Roose, George Boleyn delivering the vial, dinner guests collapsing at the table. Every detail invented. Fiction contaminating history. Suspect 3. And this is the one nobody talks about. Henry himself. Think about it from the king's position. Henry had just spent 3 weeks engineering a legal trap that brought every clergyman in England to their knees, manufacturing a retroactive crime out of thin air, weaponizing it into a constitutional revolution, using intermediaries so his own fingerprints never touched the threat directly. The man who designed that operation doesn't throw tantrums. He builds machines. Fisher just humiliated him, publicly, in front of the entire convocation, forced him to accept a compromise that gutted the supremacy title's real power. 8 words, "as far as the law of God allows," turned a declaration of absolute authority into a conditional statement. Fisher, a single bishop, outmaneuvered the King of England. 7 days later, Fisher's kitchen is poisoned. Now, the official version says Henry was horrified by the crime and demanded unprecedented punishment, and maybe that's true. But consider the alternative. What if the punishment wasn't justice? What if it was a message? Look at what Henry actually did. He didn't send Roose to trial. A trial involves witnesses, cross-examination, a defense, questions about who hired Roose, who gave him the powder, who told him which kitchen to target. A trial is a process that uncovers information. Henry bypassed all of that. He went directly to Parliament and asked for an attainder, a law that declared Roose guilty without trial, without jury, without any of the procedural machinery that might have forced inconvenient questions into the public record. And the punishment he demanded, boiling alive, a method that had never been used in England, a spectacle so extreme that it dominated every conversation in London for weeks, did something very specific. It made the story about the punishment, not about the crime, not about who was behind it, not about the 7-day gap between a bishop's defiance and a bishop's poisoning. The cauldron at Smithfield became the headline. Everything else disappeared behind it. If you wanted to bury a conspiracy, you could not design a better burial. And there's one more thing. The act for poisoning didn't just kill Roose. It created a legal precedent, the attainder as a weapon against individuals, deployed without trial. The first time it was used on a cook, the second time on a nun, the third time on a chancellor, then on a queen, then on Fisher himself. The legal tool forged in response to the poisoning of Fisher's kitchen was used, 4 years later, to execute Fisher. The system of expanded treason laws that grew from this case, the principle that Parliament could destroy a person without the protection of a court, was turned against the very man it was supposedly designed to avenge. Was that an irony? Or was it the plan? Because if you're Henry, if you're playing the long game, building a machine that lets you remove anyone who stands in your way without ever bothering with a jury, then the Roose case did something far more valuable than punish a cook. It proved the machine worked. Parliament would vote to kill a man on the king's say-so. No judge required, no evidence scrutinized, no awkward questions about who really provided the poison. And over the next decade, that precedent ate everyone. Nuns, chancellors, queens, and the very bishop whose kitchen started the whole thing. What do we actually know? Here's where I have to be honest with you, because this is the point where documented history ends and speculation begins. And the difference matters. What is documented? Fisher was, by name and by the consensus of multiple independent sources, the central figure of the clerical resistance in February 1531. The king responded to that resistance with a direct and personalized threat, sent specifically after Fisher was identified as the decisive voice. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, was physically present as the king's negotiator in those same days. The poisoning occurred exactly 7 days after the crisis resolved. Henry bypassed the normal justice system entirely, choosing a legislative condemnation that prevented any trial from occurring. The legal mechanism created by this case was later used to execute Fisher and multiple other political opponents. What is not documented? Any causal link between the convocation crisis and the poisoning. The historians who specialize in the Roose case, Stacey, Kesselring, don't mention the convocation at all. Their explanation for why the crime became a state matter focuses on internal legal reasoning, not political conspiracy. Any evidence identifying who provided the poison or directed Roose, any proof that Henry, the Boleyns, or any political figure was involved. The relationship between the political crisis and the poisoning is a temporal correlation of extraordinary suggestiveness, not a demonstrated causal connection. No serious historian rules out coincidence. Accidental food poisoning was common in Tudor kitchens without refrigeration, and Roose, by his own account, had a personal motive. But no serious historian rules out the alternative either, because the file was never opened wide enough to close it. So, what happened next? You've been listening to a story about a king who wanted to marry a woman. Here's how that story ended. Henry did marry Anne Boleyn. In January 1533, secretly before his first marriage was officially annulled. By May, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a man considerably more cooperative than Fisher, declared Catherine's marriage void. Anne was crowned queen in June. She was pregnant. The whole machinery of state, the break with Rome, the act of supremacy, the execution of anyone who objected, had been built for this moment. Anne gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth. Not the son he'd restructured an entire civilization to produce. 3 years later, in 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was thin to non-existent. She was condemned by, you can probably guess, an act of attainder, the same tool. She was beheaded at the Tower of London on May 19, 1536. She was 35 years old. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later. Jane gave him his son, Edward, and died 12 days after childbirth. Henry married 3 more times after that, 6 wives total. 2 divorced, 2 beheaded, 1 died, 1 survived. Edward became king at age 9, Edward VI. He's the one who repealed the Act for Poisoning in 1547. No one would ever be legally sentenced to death by boiling in England again. And the break with Rome, the split that Fisher died trying to prevent, that break became permanent. The Church of England exists today. The monarch of the United Kingdom is still, formally, its supreme head. Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, a title given by a pope to a king who would burn the relationship to the ground. Every English monarch after him kept it too. As for Fisher, in 1935, 400 years after his execution, the Catholic Church canonized him. He is St. John Fisher, patron of the Diocese of Rochester. The man who was poisoned, survived, defied the king, and was executed by the legal system that his own poisoning created. And Richard Roose, the cook, the man without a name, without a past, without a provable motive, remains what he has always been. The first body fed into the machine. The case no one solved. The file that stays open. You've seen the evidence, the 7-day gap, the king who bypassed the courts, the confession pulled out of a man on the rack, the execution so spectacular that it buried every question beneath the smoke. 3 suspects, Roose acting alone, the Boleyns protecting their future, or Henry clearing the board, and 500 years without a verdict. So I want to hear it from you. Who do you think poisoned Fisher's kitchen, and why? Drop it in the comments. Lay out your theory. Tell me what I missed. Tell me where I got it wrong. The case has been cold for half a millennium. Might as well put it to a jury. And one more thing. If this is the kind of case you want to see more of, the ones where the official story has a crack in it and nobody bothered to look inside, tell me which one you want next. History is full of files that were closed too early. Let's open another one.